Well, hi everyone. Here we are again with Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson for part 11 and part 12 of Rewriting History. Now, this episode is episode 11. If you want to see the previous episodes, 1 to 10, you can go to the Answers in Genesis YouTube channel, or if you now subscribe, which is a very minimal cost, to answers.tv, our own streaming platform, they'll all be up on there, and that's really the best place to keep up to date with all of this. Well, episode 11, and Dr. Jeanson said that this is sort of a summary of it: a revolution in pre-Columbian history. Who ruled the Americas before Columbus? For years, we've been taught that the Americas were sparsely populated by primitive peoples who lived in such harmony with nature that they were nearly invisible. Then Europeans came with their guns, destroying both nature, Native Americans, and Native American culture. New evidence from a surprising source shows this stereotype to be wrong. And the source? Mainstream archaeology. So, Dr. Jeanson, this is going to be very interesting. I'm sure you might raise a few eyebrows, maybe. I don't know. So, why don't you take it from here?
These next several episodes are going to be quite eyebrow raising, so it'll be exciting to see how people respond. This is again all part of our ongoing series, as Ken mentioned, A New History of the Human Race, and we're finally getting to what I've subtitled this for several episodes: the resettling of the Americas before Columbus and other surprises from DNA. And we've seen many surprises that change the stereotypes of how we understand who we came from. We see so many differences in our world today, culturally, linguistically, physically, and our sinful natures want to push people away and treat them as foreign and separate and different. And somehow we know that somehow it connects, but we have this evolutionary mindset of it's just this distant past, and I guess it happens, but don't really think about it. And not surprisingly, there's all sorts of racist stereotypes and attitudes that arise from that. We're seeing that the things we've taken for granted as the relationships among us today are often wrong. As well, the assumptions that we carry into our views about ancient history. I've grown up thinking, well, ancient Egypt is not my heritage. The Greeks are not my heritage. Maybe there's some cultural influences we have from the Greeks in terms of Western civilization, but I'm half German. My mother was born and raised in Germany. My dad's been American for several generations. So what do I have to do with ancient Egypt, with ancient Persia? Well, I've discovered through genetics that this stereotype I've had of my relationship with the ancients is also wrong. And I've promised that we're going to discover several shocking facts about the history of the planet when we ask the question of who we come from. I've said we're going to see that so-called black white people exist. We're just various shades of brown. But Caucasians are running around the Americas, in Europe, who think they've had Caucasian ancestors for thousands of years, when in fact they've had dark-skinned ancestors for thousands of years, and wouldn't know it apart from the genetics we're going to discuss. We've seen in previous episodes, especially episodes 7 through 10, that most Europeans, Western Europeans, Eastern Europeans, are of recent Asian ancestry. So we think of ourselves, I think of myself, well, I'm a Caucasian, look at my features. Yet you go back 1,000 years, a few hundred years for some Eastern Europeans, and there's Asians in the family tree. And we've also seen that genetically, most European nationalities disappear. Sure, we like to take pride in our heritage, Italian cooking. I like to take pride in my German heritage when it's something to be proud of, like winning the World Cup, not so much when it deals with the Nazis. So these nationalistic identities, they disappear at the genetic level within a few hundred years. We're going to look at this episode, and in several subsequent episodes, a shocking fact about the Americas, that they were resettled at least once before Columbus arrived. And eventually we're going to get back to the most ancient times and deal with questions about the Neanderthals, who they were, whether they were primitive or not, and discover that they were likely the survivors of several ancient catastrophes. Now, my goal in all this...
Dr. Jensen, if I can just ask again for you to also summarize that a lot of this really comes out of genetics research, and particularly dealing with the Y chromosome that's inherited through the male. And
yes,
the differences because of mutations and the similarities and so on.
Yes, and this is information you won't find anywhere else. You can't go to a popular genetic testing company and say, hey, I heard about these shocking discoveries about history. Can you tell you who I come from? They can't do that. On one hand, most of their tests look at DNA that's inherited from both parents. And my German signal, I'm half German. I'm 50% genetically German. And my children are going to be 25%, and it drops by half every generation. So that signal of my ancestry goes away real fast. So if you take one of these tests, you're likely only going to know what you already know from your family tree anyways. They only go back 4 or 5 generations. And then if they look at the Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA, they're still operating with a mainstream timescale that human history goes back hundreds of thousands of years. And they don't even think of looking for the signature of the history of civilization, the Persians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Mongols, and so forth. In fact, because they stretch out human history so long, it's very difficult for them to see the signatures of this history. And what we're seeing is that when you look at these particular compartments, and we've seen now it's the Y chromosome, the male inherited DNA, that's key, and you view it through the young Earth timescale, number one, you see history pop out, and it's a confirmation that it's the young Earth timescale that's the valid one, and not the old Earth timescale. And the principle that we're applying is really just the principle of family trees. The closer the branches connect, the more recently we have a common ancestor. The more distant the branches connect, the more distant past we have a common ancestor. And it's this process of this existence of a DNA clock that allows us to make these sorts of inferences. So if Ken and I get a Y chromosome test and our DNA differences are very few, and it leads to the reconstruction of a family tree with short connections, that means we have a recent ancestor. If he and I have a lot of Y chromosomes differences between us, we have to go back in the distant past to find our common ancestor. And so there's major apologetic applications if you're watching this as a creationist. If you're not a creationist and you're watching, this is a very strong challenge to the mainstream view that I think everyone should consider. But my even bigger goal in all this is not just apologetic, although that's a gigantic goal. My goal is even bigger, that we'd marvel at who we've come from, who we are. We'd marvel at the histories of those we love in a way we've never dreamed of marveling before. This is new research. These are things I wouldn't have dreamed of myself concluding 5-10 years ago. This is recent research. These are facts you won't find anywhere else. This is the only place to find it right now, and hopefully it'll be in a book within the next 12 to 18 months. So today, let's think about the Native Americans. And I'm going to start by thinking about one of the famous men from the Wild West, George Armstrong Custer. On June 25th, 1876, he led a regiment of U.S. Army soldiers to engage a group of Cheyenne and Sioux warriors near the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. Now, this is post-Civil War era. The U.S. as a nation is pushing westward. They're trying to ensure safe passage for settlers, fortune seekers, gold seekers, and standing in the way from the European perspective are the Native Americans, led by, in this case, Sitting Bull. Now, one of Custer's fatal mistakes that day was he underestimated the size of the enemy that he faced. He thought there were only about 800, turns out there were about 2,000. The other fatal mistake that he made was to divide up his band into 3 groups. He was trying to surprise them, and the people who got surprised that day were Custer and his men, who in their famous last stand all lost their lives on a hill that day. So this was a victory for the Native Americans. 14 and a half years later, on December 29th, 1890, the close of the 1800s, a fight broke out near Wounded Knee Creek, again between U.S. Army soldiers and Native Americans. In this case, though, it was a massacre, and several hundred Lakota Sioux tribes people were dead at the end of it, buried in a mass grave, and that effectively closed the chapter that was the Native American resistance to European incursions westward. Now, if you're like me, you've grown up being taught that Native Americans had been here in the Americas for thousands of years. They were primitive, so to speak, in their technology and their ways of life, but it was a very peaceful, nature-loving, nature-respecting existence, and along came the Europeans with their guns of multiple sizes and shapes, who wiped them out in short order because the Native Americans had no such technology with which to resist it. Bows and arrows couldn't stand up to guns. Now, I've discovered in the last few years, from mainstream archaeology of all sources, that this view of the Americas is being overturned. So who are these people? Who did they come from, and what were they doing here before Columbus arrived? We've seen in episode 1, the world is smaller than we think. The history of human population growth shows a spike in the last few hundred years, so that going back just a few generations, maybe 20 generations, there's a lot fewer people to find as a spouse. So you either have to marry someone who's a closer relative than we might be more comfortable with today, or you need to marry someone outside your group. And this is going to begin to connect the family trees of humanities in ways that we hadn't expected. We've also done the math of human population, the math of our ancestors. I have 2 parents, we each have 2 parents, so 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16, 32. And in just 1,000 years, this is still the AD era, Middle Ages, I have, in theory, more ancestors in my family tree than there are people alive on the planet. That can't possibly be true. My parents must be more related to each other than I've previously thought of them as. Which means that if you apply that math around the globe, there must be more connections among the ethnic groups, so-called racial groups, than we're used to thinking about. We've looked at the genetics of this to see how easy racial or ethnic change can occur, just a few generations. This means that if you combine it with the math of human reproductive growth, that in theory, most of Europe could be of recent African descent. We've seen that, in fact, they're of recent Asian descent. And if you go back to episode 4, you can see just how easy it is for this sort of process to occur. We've also seen that the global family tree is much more shallow, much shorter than we used to thinking about, even as young Earth creationists. So we throw out the term 6,000 years, 4,500 years from the time of the flood, which are dramatically different from the evolutionary time scale. If you convert those years, though, to generations, it becomes even more shocking. To go from 8 people at the time of the flood to the nearly 8 billion alive in the world today is just 200 generational steps or less. And so you start to think about, okay, 8 to 8 billion and 200 steps or less. Whoa, that means we have to start connecting the family trees much more quickly than we're used to thinking about. We've also seen, as I mentioned earlier, that it's the male inherited DNA, and you can go back to episodes 5 and 6 to see why it's this specific segment of our DNA that's so key. It doesn't get diluted by the other parent's DNA, by mom's DNA. and it's a clock that exists in our cells. It ticks every generation. It marks off how many generations have passed since, let's say, Ken and I have had a common ancestor, since my wife's family and my family have had a common ancestor. Anyone has had a common ancestor. You can see this then through the global Y chromosome tree. In episode 7, we began to see what this tree tells us about who we come from, beginning with Europe. We've looked for the lost relatives of Europe, seen connections between Britain and India, even though we've grown up thinking that when the East India Company arrived on the shores of India in the 1600s, this was a long-awaited meeting of two ancient cultures. Well, in fact, they shared a recent common ancestor in the 1500s. We've seen that there's a good chunk of Europe and of India and of the Middle East and Central Asia that has recent Mongol ancestry. They don't even know it. It's only revealed through the Y chromosome. Consistent with history, but not something we'd expect. We've also seen that another third of Eastern Europe has an ancient Chinese connection. That's not something you'd expect given what we've thought about of China as being this long-standing, isolated culture, which it has been, yet there's these genetic connections that have escaped and slipped through and connected to modern Europe. We looked at who settled the Americas after Columbus in last time, episode 10, and seen that it's primarily Western Europeans, but Western Europeans have recent Central Asian ancestry. And so I think of myself as Caucasian, yet you go back 1,000 years and lo and behold, or even a few hundred years, and lo and behold, it's Central Asians who are in the family tree, not indigenous Europeans. So that's the hidden history of the Americas, the ancestors of most Americans. And so most Americans today, at least in the US, are Caucasian. Latin America, those have a European influence, the vast majority of recent European ancestry, yet these Europeans are themselves descendants of Central Asians in the recent past. So today we want to look at the revolution in pre-Columbian history. And to set it up, I want to review what I grew up with, which is probably, I'm assuming, what many of you viewers have grown up with. When I took history in high school, we took world history and we took US history. And so Native Americans were in the context of learning about the history of the United States. So for me growing up, the history of the Americas began with Columbus's arrival in 1492. And then it took a leap forward, talking maybe about Jamestown. That was just in passing. And the real business of the Americas got started in 1620 with the arrival of the Pilgrims, the first Thanksgiving, peaceful relationships between the Europeans and the Native Americans. Eventually, history moves to the first 13 colonies. Then the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the War for Independence. And then this moves this new nation inevitably westward as the U.S. acquires the Louisiana Purchase and other parts of the U.S., and people begin to move into these newly acquired territories. And it was this process of arriving on the Atlantic seaboard and pushing westward where we learned about the Native Americans as they were encountered by Europeans. Now, the Native American history for me has always been a gigantic blank spot. I'm used to thinking about the groups of peoples in geographic and ecological categories, woodlands peoples in the Northeast, Plains Indians like the Sioux in the Midwest. And of course, we learned first about the Iroquois and Mohawk and other Northeastern groups, because that's where the Europeans first arrived. And so we learned about their ways of life and their cultures, their longhouses, their weapons, which I always found fascinating. Also their hairstyles, obviously, to this day, I still find very interesting and appreciate it. But in terms of weaponry, grew up with the idea that they were no match for European guns. And so inevitably then, you see early in US history, forcible removals of Native Americans from their homelands westward. So the Trail of Tears, moving the Chickasaw and Choctaw and Cherokee and Creek and Seminole tribes from their southeastern United States homelands into now modern day Oklahoma. And of course, as the US keeps pushing westward, these encounters continue. Grew up reading Little House on the Prairie. They talk about encounters as they're pushing westward with these Native Americans. And of course, the Plains tribes are often the most romanticized. And when we think of Native Americans as Americans, thinking of fellow Americans, this is often what we think of subconsciously. Those who rode horses, survived on the buffalo, using every part of it for their existence. Europeans moving westward with their guns and slaughtering massive numbers of them, which is a threat to the Native American way of life. And of course, the eventual loss of Native American culture and lives at the hands of the US Army. But who were these people? With that history, I still had no concept of their story, of their origins, their migration narratives. I couldn't tell you anything about what happened before Europeans were here. And this has always been a nagging mystery to me. And one of the first steps towards wiping that blank slate clean and writing something down came when I lived in Texas. So for 6 years, I worked for the Institute for Creation Research before moving to Answers in Genesis. They're based in Dallas, Texas. Dallas-Fort Worth is one large metropolitan area. So the Fort Worth stockyards are one of the historical cultural attractions. And it was in the gift shop that my family and I went through one day. And in the gift shop was a map up there on the wall. This wasn't the map, this is the closest approximation I could find. It was a map of the tribes, I presume, on the eve of Columbus's arrival or the arrival of Europeans on now U.S. shores. And what struck me, and what this map does a little bit of justice to, is the demarcation of boundaries of these several different tribes. This is a language map, so there's, in some cases, you can see this teal greenish shaded area here has multiple tribes. It may not be visible on your screen, but there's boundaries here and here. What struck me and finally connected for me was the fact that this map of North America, of the modern U.S., in terms of its Indian nation regions, looked very much like Europe. There were all sorts of, so I guess you could say, country boundaries, and it was pockmarked with all these various tribes in a way that looked like how I thought of Europe. And so this finally was a light bulb for me to say, okay, this is what Europe looks like, and Europe has a long history in which I can tell you a long series of events. It finally connected this mystery to something tangible for me. And of course, we all know there's a history here for the Native Americans, but I had nothing to connect it to, nothing I could say. This very simple observation began to raise for me the possibility of discovering this history. Another key step for me was again in Texas. One of the books that was popular, was a good seller, was Empire of the Summer Moon. Connor Parker and the Rise and Fall of the Comanches, the most powerful Indian tribe in American history. They were a Texas tribe at the time of the European push westward. And in this book, which is a pretty fascinating read, focusing primarily on those interactions in the early westward push days, the author, S.C. Gwynn, made a comment, almost a throwaway sentence, but it caught my eye. He said, the Comanches, came from the high country in a place we now call Wyoming, above the headwaters of the Arkansas River. And so to put it on the map for us, he was saying they originally were up here, then they came down to here in the 1600s, 1700s, post-Columbus, yes, but pre-European push westward. This finally was now an event you could recognize as part of the story of these peoples. So this is hardly any story I'm telling you, but the blank spot in my mind, I'm guessing for so many other people as well, was so empty just to have some small inkling of what was going on, even if it's right before Europeans pushed westward, was revolutionary for me. The biggest revolution, though, came when I moved to Kentucky, worked for Answers in Genesis. I live in Boone County, which is not that populated, but it has, apparently because of our tax dollars, a fairly well-funded library, and had this book, 1491 by Charles Mann. He's a science journalist, mainstream science journalist for Science magazines written. So he adopts the mainstream scientific timescale. He's not a creationist whatsoever, but wrote this book, 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus, and tells his story as having grown up decades ago, learning the stereotypical views that we all learned about the history of the Americas before the arrival of Europeans, or probably very little of that history, just here's who Europeans interacted with as they pushed westward. Then he said he grew up, had a son, his son went to school, learned the same sorts of things. And it struck him that as a science writer, he'd been attending all these archaeological conferences, hearing about all these massive changes in understanding about these peoples, and thought, someone should really write a book about this. Now, he says, and gives this disclaimer at the beginning of his book, and this was shocking to me. It's a nonfiction archaeology book, essentially, but for me, a real page turner, because what he says is so remarkable. He said, this book is not a systematic chronological account of the Western Hemisphere's cultural and social development before 1492. He said, such a book could not be written. By the time the author approached the end, the beginning would be outdated. So he's saying, I'm not even going to try to write to you a full account of this. Things are changing so fast in archaeology, you can't even keep up with it. So he picks three main topics and says, I'm just going to sketch for you what's been going on. So the first main topic I've learned from this, and also following then the literature since reading this book, this came out in 2005. I've read it within the last 5 or so years since moving to Kentucky. One of the things he points out is, and one of the things I appreciated now and didn't appreciate before, is that when Columbus arrives, it's 1492, U.S. history, arrival of the Pilgrims, is over a century later. There's an over a century gap between the first permanent arrival of the Europeans and the general starting point of US history. This over a century gap is silent and contains long-held secrets that we're just beginning to uncover. And of course, the European push westward, 1800s, is a 3-century gap. And if we think of that battle between Custer and the Sioux and Cheyenne, nearly 4 centuries have passed. So this romanticized view of the Native Americans that we've grown up with represents a group of people who are the descendants of those who first encountered Columbus 4 centuries prior. And that multi-century gap in time contains all sorts of mysteries we're just beginning to unravel. One of these secrets comes from and was buried in the baptism and death records of many of the Spanish churches in Latin America. What I don't mean is that they were kept secret and obscured. What I mean is that no one bothered to pay attention to what they were saying. So in the past 50 years or so, people have gone back to these records, those that were closest to the arrival of Columbus, and noticed a pattern. The number of baptisms among these native groups was far less than the number of deaths that recorded. And they began to plot these numbers and say, okay, many years, many decades after Columbus arrived, there were this many baptisms and death. And if you move back a little bit closer, there's this big skew, and there were far more people dying than being baptized. And then the gap gets even bigger. And you start drawing a curve backwards, you realize there was a massive die-off when Europeans arrived, due to multiple factors, apparently. The introduction of diseases to which the natives weren't resistant. There was, of course, enslavement as well, brutal treatment of these natives, particularly in Latin America, and many other factors. But it's the magnitude of this die-off. You may have already heard this because it's a common concept in today's Western culture that many people died. But the sheer number of it is something I didn't appreciate until reading this book. So current estimates, sort of middle-of-the-road estimates for how many people were here in the Americas on the eve of Columbus's arrival, put about 4 million people in North America. And when I say North America, for our purposes today, I mean north of the Rio Grande. In Central America and the Caribbean, a whopping 26 million people were present. And in South America, about 24 million. And just to put this in context, because, okay, these might sound like big numbers, but compared to what? Well, around this time in Europe, there were 78 million people. In Africa, 45 million people. So there's more people in the Americas. This isn't some small primitive band of people. There's massive numbers of people, more people in the Americas than in Africa. And then what happens 300 years later, by the time we reach the 1800s, that number has dropped to under 10 million. Europe has expanded to 180 million people. Africa, despite the ongoing transatlantic slave trade, is 70 million people. This is a massive decline. Upwards of 80 to 90% of the people who were here apparently died out and were gone several centuries later. Now, I said this is a middle-of-the-road figure because you're using death records that post-date Columbus, and you've got a few data points, and then you try to extrapolate into the past. There's still severe debate within the academic community about what this number exactly is. On the low end, there's about, some would say, 8.4 million people, which if you then go forward to the 1800s, that puts very little die-off in those intervening centuries. The upper end of those, this though, it puts it at 112 million people, which is just under the combined total of Europe and Africa. So 53 million is sort of middle of the road, very close to the population of Europe. And Mann says in his book that some American cities were larger than the leading European cities in their day. So massive numbers of people in 1491, much larger than what we thought, so that when the Americans push westward, when Custer encounters the 2,000 Sioux and Cheyenne, he's encountering the last remnants of a resistance to moving to a reservation. At this time in U.S. history, the U.S. population is around 44 million, the vast majority of which are being European Americans. So what is the point of all this? Well, the idea that it's guns and cannons that were superior to bows and arrows, and this is why the Native Americans were unable to resist, is only a small part of the story. When these groups of people encounter one another violently in the late 1800s, the Native Americans are at a severe population disadvantage. The seeds of their eventual loss were sown several centuries prior. My point is, when Custer encounters the Sioux and Cheyenne, he's encountering a relic, a small relic of what once existed in North America. One of the second points Mann makes in his book deals with another stereotype that is often associated with this concept of small numbers. And you may recognize it more if we think about the South American Amazonian tribes. For me, subconsciously, and I'm sure for many other people, we see these tribes, we think, oh, they're these backwards, primitive ways of life. And Charles Mann in his book points out many of the common views we've held. We view them as, some people view them as unchanged holdovers from humankind's ancient past, as if they've never left the Stone Age, the Paleolithic age. So he's, of course, speaking in mainstream terms. But I think many of us have the subconscious view that, yes, they never quite reached the advanced technology of the Europeans who came along. Mann goes through a number of evidences showing that this view is also wrong from mainstream archaeology. I'm going to show you things that have come after his book came out in 2005, recent ongoing research that overthrows things we've taken for granted for so many years. So let me take this paper from 2018. So again, Mann's book is written in 2005, and this just shows you again what he pointed out at the beginning. Namely, you almost can't write a book about this because it's changing so fast. The research is still ongoing. We're still uncovering things about the Americas we never thought existed. So this particular study this paper was titled Ecological Consequences of Post-Columbian Indigenous Depopulation in the Andean Amazonian Corridor. So if you strip away the academic word salad, what they're saying here is they looked at a cloud forest in Ecuador. So cloud forest, save the rainforest, once a cloud forest, always a cloud forest. These are things we've grown up with. The research that they did was to find a lake in this cloud forest in Ecuador and take sediment layers from this lake. And within the sediment layers, you can then look for various types of plant species and the types of pollen grains. So to give a practical example, here in Kentucky, I've got a bunch of maple trees in my backyard. They're shedding stuff all the time, leaves, seeds, so forth. These things will eventually settle in lakes, settle to the bottom, and over time, several centuries, these layers will build up, and so you can go back and basically read off the history, the ecological history of this location from the layers in this lake. So we've grown up with this idea, save the rainforest. The Native Americans have been these peaceful people, small numbers, in small bands, with a very primitive way of life, coexisting, doing very little to disturb the ecological equilibrium. So what is mainstream science, Sam? Starting here, because this isn't some wacko creationist on the corner of the internet coming up with this stuff. This is the mainstream community saying these things and overturning popular stereotypes about how we thought about this. So there's another tool they use so that you can look through these layers and see the various plant species alive at the time based on their pollen grains and other materials. You can also do carbon dating. Now, in future episodes, we're going to talk about what carbon dating says about the ancient past. There's severe disagreement, of course, among creationists and evolutionists there. If you're familiar with the creationist literature, you know that there's been a lot of research happening showing that for ancient dates, the carbon-14 actually strongly contradicts evolutionary timescales. That's another story for another day. We're going to talk about the usefulness for ancient dates. For now, though, we're looking at more recent history, the last few 100,000 years. Their creationists and evolutionists agree that it's a useful tool. So living things are made of carbon. You can use carbon-14 to date them. So you can not only find out the types of plants in various layers, you can assign dates. So that's what they did to these layers. The year 2000, 1900, 1800, so on. And you can move up and down through these sediments to see what happened. So let's start with the top, because this is a way to check whether or not their techniques are working. At the top end of these sediment layers, you find, and you can date these layers appropriate to their history, you find evidence of plants consistent with a cloud forest, with this type of jungle. Okay, no problem there. Well, if you move down into the 1600s, those layers, you see all sorts of plant remains from grassland plant species. Well, this is odd. Where it gets really interesting is where you go back to the pre-Columbian layers, and I should say pre-population decline. This part of Ecuador was associated with the Incan Empire. The Incan Empire also underwent massive population decline, though in this part of Ecuador, it didn't happen in 1492. It happened more in the late 1500s, like 1588. So where it gets really interesting is if you look at the layers below 1588, what you don't see is plant remains from cloud forest or necessarily grasslands. What you see is plant remains from maize, from corn. Around the time of the Native Americans, before Europeans arrived, this was not a cloud forest. This was farmland. These people here had transformed their environment And what we see today is very different from the way things were back then. So the authors themselves say, we show that 19th century descriptions of this area in Ecuador as a pristine wilderness recorded a shifted ecological baseline, one that less than 250 years earlier had consisted of heavily managed and cultivated landscapes. So within a few centuries, it went from farmland to something that may be a poster child for save the rainforest. So this idea of save the rainforest, it's always been this way, and Europeans have come in and crushed it. Not true. So in the book, so this is back from 2005, Mann quotes, and he interviews a lot of leading mainstream archaeologists. They say the Amazon landscape itself, Brazil, so I talked about Ecuador, talk about Brazil, at least 10% of it looks anthropogenic, cultivated by humans. And this is, again, ongoing. We could talk about papers if we had time that have come out since then, looking at, and the evidence you look for is multifaceted. Sometimes you look for plant species that would be cultivated orchards. So the Amazon soil is very poor. One of the clever things that the natives did was to effectively plant trees that grow very well in the rainforest, and you then can eat their fruit. And even today, people are now going back and revisiting and saying, well, what did they do, and what could we learn from them to understand what was actually going on, and to rationally and effectively use the rainforest in the most effective way. Let me give you one more paper, again, that's come out since Mann. This is from 2018. Here they're looking at the evidence for human occupation in terms of their earthworks, their earth mounds. So you can look for cultivated trees versus wild trees. You can look for what they call black earth. So again, the soil is poor. There's all sorts of evidence of the natives here going through and putting in fertilizers to make the soil more productive. So human transformation of the Amazon. This is a study saying, let's look at their earthworks, mound remnants of people being here. And just to jump to the conclusion then, they say we assume that a population between 500,000 and 1 million for the south rim of the Amazon, so they're only looking at a segment of the Amazon, in late pre-Columbian times, right before Columbus arrives, is a reasonable estimate. And they say the fact that the predicted area of their earthworks in this part of the Amazon, the fact that it comprises merely 7% of the Amazon, could have sustained a population of hundreds of thousands. It discredits the old views. So even in the last 2 years, they're still overturning long-held views. Let's simplify that academic mumbo jumbo and put some numbers that are more accessible in front of us. So they're saying we're looking at 7% of the Amazon, and we see at the low end evidence that this could have supported 500,000 people. Well, what would 100% of the Amazon be supporting then? Do the math. That supports 7 million people for the whole region of the Amazon, 1491. Take the upper end. They say, well, we're looking at 7% based on the earthworks. There's 1 million people who could have been living here. The upper end means that the whole Amazon could have supported 14 million people. 14 million people, what does that mean? Well, think about this in 1491. If there were 14 million people, again, not small primitive bands, but people actively transforming their environment, cultivating the rainforest, so forth, this would have been equivalent to, in 1491, the population, the combined populations of Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, Ukraine, and the western part of Russia, the part that's considered Europe. That whole shaded region of yellow, that's how many people were alive, that equivalent. There were massive numbers of people here transforming it. So these have been Latin American examples. Mann extends it back to North America, which is more familiar to me, having grown up here in the States. And he says the same rules apply there. They're not primitive peoples living in passive harmony with nature. They were actively transforming it through fire and so forth. He said rather than domesticate animals for meat, the Indians retooled ecosystems to encourage elk, deer, and bear by the constant burning of the undergrowth. And this would increase the number of herbivores and the predators that fed on them and the people who ate them both. So much so that rather being a thick, unbroken, monumental snarl of trees, imagined by the famous writer Thoreau, the great eastern forest of the United States was an ecological kaleidoscope. And remember, he's talking about the Indians, not the colonial America. The Indians had transformed it into garden plots of blackberry rambles, pine barrens, and spacious groves of chestnut, hickory, and oak. They had done so much transformation that the first white settlers in Ohio found woodlands that resembled English parks. They could ride carriages through the trees. So these people are anything but unchanged holdovers from the Stone Age. Mann had a very helpful analogy. He said, imagine you were dropped into Nazi Germany at the end of World War II and came across a concentration camp, not knowing any of the history that preceded this. you would see these people who'd been barefoot and starving, and it's as if you encountered these people and thought, well, they must have always been barefoot and starving. There always were these primitive people barely surviving, eking out an existence in Germany. Then you learn the history of World War II and you say, oh, wait a minute, I've got this all wrong. These are survivors of a recently shattered culture. Mann points out, and the research, mainstream research is increasingly pointing this out, the Native Americans are like that. The old view is like being dropped into Nazi Germany, not knowing the history. Now we can see, in light of this archaeological thing, we're uncovering from the surfaces and digging below the surface and realizing these Native Americans, these so-called primitive peoples, they're survivors of a recently shattered culture. There were massive numbers of people here transforming their environments. Their numbers underwent this massive 80-90% population collapse, so that where there was once farmland, there's now these cloud forests. When Custer engages the Sioux and Cheyenne, he's engaging a very small remnant of an advanced civilization that once lived here. So their eventual forced removal to reservations and eventual loss wasn't so much necessarily at the hands of guns. That loss and the victory of the Europeans over them, the seeds of that narrative were sown several centuries prior. And we're just beginning to uncover some of this history. This is the revolution that's happening in our understanding of pre-Columbian history. In our next episode, episode 12, we're going to look at an even bigger bombshell, one that mainstream science never saw coming and that radically rewrites how we understand the history of the Americas before Columbus. This is the new history of the human race, and we're just beginning to uncover, and we're going to spend several episodes on uncovering what's been a long blank spot for me. And from some of the feedback I've gotten, I think many of our viewers, it's been a long blank spot as well. And we're gonna see some radical things that I've just covered now. This is just the beginning. We're going to recover a whole lot more radical things in forthcoming episodes.
Dr. Jensen, you got me on the edge of my seat now, and can't wait for episode 12, which will be the next one tomorrow night. The resettling of the Americas before Columbus. So what happened in the Americas before Columbus? What is the history of Native Americans? Mainstream science has maintained that today's Native Americans are the descendants of the first people who migrated to America from Asia around 15,000 years ago, but modern genetics upends this view with radical implications for who was here first and who followed. So this is going to be very interesting, and I really wonder what's going to happen here. Maybe this will get into the newspapers and and radically alter how people view things. But hey, you're trying to challenge people's thinking and rewriting history and say, don't just accept some of the things that have been forced on you, and particularly from secularists who weren't there, who don't know everything. What a difference when you've done some real research here. And of course, the biblical foundation builds a worldview that makes sense of all of this.
Yes, and one of the most helpful feedbacks I've gotten was from a pastor who had been following this, and some of the research I'm going to discuss next episode has just come out in our research journal. And I posted that link on Facebook, and a light bulb went on for him, and he said, this is groundbreaking new research. This isn't just, here's why evolution is wrong. You're discovering new things about the world. And it was like, wow, I didn't think the young Earth model could actually do this. So this is a real bombshell that's coming. And to me, a whole new chapter in the wider global creation evolution debate.
Well, we look forward to the next episode, episode 12. And again, people can go to the Answers in Genesis YouTube channel or subscribe to answers.tv. It's just over $3 a month US to subscribe, and you get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Answers in Genesis videos, including all these programs as well, and all the future programs and future conferences. That's really the best way to do it, is to go to answers.tv.